Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking an absolute epic. We're looking at a 600-year saga covering the incredible rise and the really tragic fall of the Kingdom of Kongo. This is a story all about brilliant human adaptation, massive geopolitical shifts, and a societal structure so complex that it ultimately paved the way for its own downfall. All right, let's jump right in. Here's our roadmap for the journey ahead. We're going to cover the birth of Kongo, a really fascinating geographic constraint involving the wheel, the Portuguese arrival, the slave trade trap, the rubber revolution, and finally, the kingdom's ultimate fall. Section 1. The birth of Kongo. Moving from scattered tribes to a fully unified kingdom. So picture the 13th century. Global temperatures are fluctuating wildly, but by the 14th century, the climate finally stabilizes, and this shift is huge because it allowed new civilizations to emerge all over the globe. Down in Southwest Africa, a group known as the Kongo people, that's Congo with a K, migrated south between 1350 and 1375. Led by a guy named Nimi Nzima, they conquered a town called Mpasi and boldly renamed it Mbanza Kongo. This newly named town, it would soon become the beating heart of a massive new civilization. Now, in this era, survival meant forming alliances. You couldn't just fight everyone. So Nimi Nzima married a princess from a neighboring state called Mbada. And what's genuinely brilliant here is the division of labor they struck up to make this marriage work. As their federation grew, Kongo essentially acted as the military center. They forcefully annexed territory and assigned the rulers. Mbada, on the other hand, was the economic center, and they were actually allowed to choose their own local rulers. It was this perfectly balanced partnership, and it fueled some seriously rapid expansion. Later, when Nimi Nzima's son, King Luseni, took power, he centralized this whole growing federation into the official Kingdom of Kongo. And to manage his rapidly expanding borders, he used this highly effective three-stage assimilation playbook. First, a neighboring region would be forced to become a vassal state. Second, through a bit of political intrigue or straight-up civil war, a member of the Kongo royal family would be installed as the new ruler. And finally, step 3, the region would be fully integrated as a province within the kingdom. Boom! It was a systematic, ruthless, and incredibly effective engine for growth. Moving on to Section 2. No wheels, only labor. And this is where we hit a truly fascinating geographic constraint. By the end of the 15th century, the Kingdom of Kongo boasted a population of over 2 million people, spread out across 100,000 square kilometers. They had these vast trade networks for copper, ivory, and legendary high-quality textiles. Yet, they had zero carts. So you've really got to ask yourself, why didn't a massive, highly organized empire like this ever use the wheel?
Well, this brilliantly illustrates the sheer power of geographic luck. Let's break down the mechanical reality of it. When you have a rotating wheel attached to a stationary cart, it creates intense friction, right? To prevent the cart from just breaking apart, you need lubricant. And before modern oil, the absolute best way to get enough fat for industrial-scale lubrication was from domesticated pigs. They breed fast, they're super fatty, perfect. But here is the kicker. There were no domesticated pigs in southern Africa, and watch how this whole thing cascades. Without pigs, there was no fat. Without fat, no carts. And without carts, or beasts of burden, the absolute only way to maintain a massive transport network was forced human labor. The entire power structure of Kongo came to rely on capturing and keeping a massive enslaved workforce, literally just to move goods from point A to point B. Which brings us to Section 3, the Portuguese arrival. A completely foreign variable is about to crash into the kingdom's carefully balanced system. The year is 1483. Imagine Congolese scouts spotting a totally strange ship entering their waters. It was the Portuguese. Now, they brought highly desired goods like steel and guns, but far more importantly, they brought access to global sea trade. Virtually overnight, Kongo wasn't just trading with its immediate neighbors on riverboats anymore. They were suddenly connected to the entire world. But to understand what happens next, we really have to look at Kongo's internal balance of power. You've got the king sitting in the capital, Mbanza Kongo. His immense power came from monopolizing all the legal trade and commanding that massive captive workforce we just talked about. Out in the provinces, you had the governors. They ruled locally, sent yearly tributes to the capital, and desperately competed for the king's favor. It was a very delicate balancing act.
So, when trade with Europe began, a very specific economic dynamic took hold. Europe was developing this ravenous appetite for sugar calories, which drove the Portuguese to seek enslaved labor for their New World plantations. Kongo, naturally, wanted European guns and steel. But, and this is crucial, the King of Kongo heavily restricted slave sales. Why? Well, because his own personal power relied on keeping that massive labor force right there in his capital. He couldn't just give them away. So initially, the Portuguese bought high-quality Congolese textiles instead, taking those fabrics up the West African coast to trade for slaves elsewhere.
Section 4. The slave trade trap. This right here is the tragic turning point where foreign influence completely hollows out the kingdom from the inside. Let's map out this relentless cycle of interference. In 1491, the king actually converts to Christianity, looking to boost trade and political ties with Portugal. But when King Afonso dies in 1542, succession crises spark vicious civil wars. And Portugal, they routinely funded the most pro-slavery factions with guns. This constant warfare made Kongo so destabilized and dangerous that in the 1560s, a unified front of their enemies, the Jaga people, invaded and completely devastated the capital. This violence ultimately culminated a century later in 1665, when a massive battle against the Portuguese resulted in the death of the Kongo king, his heirs, and hundreds of his nobles. The crucial takeaway here is how that 1560s Jaga invasion completely inverted the kingdom's power dynamic. Because the capital was depopulated and destroyed, the king lost his massive labor force, meaning he lost his large army.
He was now entirely reliant on his provincial governors, and those governors, guys out in places like the wealthy Soyo province, had been using independent, under-the-table slave trading to stockpile Portuguese guns for years. They now commanded massive provincial armies that rivaled or even completely dwarfed the king's own forces.
This internal fracturing triggered a brutal economic domino effect. As factions fought these endless civil wars for the throne, they naturally targeted each other's cities. But here is the catch. The cities were where all the kingdom's highly skilled textile and pottery artisans lived. Instead of making goods, these master craftsmen were captured and sold to the Americas. In a twist of truly grim irony, those exact same Congolese artisans ended up growing cotton on American plantations, which fed European textile factories, which then sold manufactured clothes back to Congo. I mean, talk about the ultimate bad business deal. They literally traded away their entire industrial capacity just to get enough guns to shoot each other. It's wild.
So, by the 18th century, Congo's once diverse, thriving economy had starkly flatlined into a single, grim purpose. Having completely lost their own manufacturing base, survival meant perpetual internal warfare and slave raids on their neighbors, all just to trade captive humans to the coast in exchange for basic European manufactured goods.
But then, we hit Section 5, the Rubber Revolution. Just when it seems the kingdom is entirely broken, a massive global shift forces a brand new economic model.
By the mid-19th century, global pressure to end the slave trade reached a boiling point. The British Navy was actively blockading the African coast. With international buyers suddenly gone, slave prices inside Congo absolutely crashed. But the lesser nobles adapted. They used this now incredibly cheap local workforce to set up sprawling agricultural plantations, growing peanuts, coffee, and crucially for the new European industrial age, rubber. And because these laborers were often paid in goods like rubber, general local markets sprang up where everyday people, not just the elites, could finally engage in trade.
This brilliantly illustrates a total shift in society. The old power, the kings and the major governors who relied on controlling the big cities and trade routes, they lost their influence as populations physically migrated out into the countryside to work these sprawling new plantations. The new power belonged to the lesser nobles running those rural communities. The kingdom became highly decentralized, and amazingly, this localized focus actually caused the overall prosperity of the average Congolese person to increase in the 1880s. It's a great reminder that sometimes decentralizing power can actually spark a surprising economic boom for the everyday person.
Sadly, we reached Section 6, the final fall, because this localized prosperity was about to collide head-on with the era of European colonization.
1884, the year of the infamous Berlin Conference. European powers sat around a table in Europe and just arbitrarily drew lines across a map of Africa, slicing up the entire continent. In this scramble, the Kingdom of Congo was officially promised to Portugal. However, under the rules of the treaty, Portugal still had to actually occupy the land with real troops to make it official. The final collapse happened incredibly fast. In 1888, during yet another Congolese civil war, Portuguese troops entered under the guise of supporting one of the factions, but once the war ended, they simply never left. They systematically dismantled local rulers, handed the wealthy plantations over to Portuguese corporations, and officially annexed Congo into the colony of Angola. It wasn't until decades later, starting in 1961 with a brutal war of independence, that the tide finally turned. Following the collapse of the Portuguese regime back in Europe in 1974, Angola finally gained its independence a year later in 1975.
Which leaves us with this final thought. To this day, the territory of the historic Kingdom of Congo remains a part of modern-day Angola. When you look at the map of Africa today, you have to ask yourself, how much do these modern borders still reflect those centuries-old trade monopolies, the search for resources, and the colonial ambitions that systematically dismantled the mighty 600-year Kingdom of Congo? It's an incredibly powerful reminder that the ghosts of history are still very much shaping our present. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the map.